The morning fog clung to the abandoned streets of Millbrook like a funeral shroud, muffling the distant groans that had become the town's new soundtrack. Kalen Thorne pressed his back against the brick wall of what used to be Morrison's hardware store, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. Through the shattered storefront window, he could see them, 3 figures shuffling between the aisles, their movements jerky and unnatural, their clothes stained with substances he refused to identify. It had been 47 days since the first reports emerged from the coastal cities. 47 days since the world stopped making sense. The news anchors had called it a viral outbreak at first, then a public health emergency, and finally, in those last desperate broadcasts before the stations went dark, the end of civilization as we know it. Kalen had been a mechanical engineer before the collapse, designing water treatment systems for rural communities. Now, his analytical mind served a different purpose, keeping himself and others alive. The sound of careful footsteps on broken glass made him turn. Zephyra Blackwood emerged from the shadows of the alley, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid, a modified crossbow slung across her shoulder. She had been a trauma surgeon at Millbrook General Hospital until the military cordoned off the building and everything inside became a feeding ground. Her steady hands, once used to save lives, now served to end the mockeries of life that wandered the streets. "The pharmacy's been cleaned out," she whispered, settling beside him. "But I found something interesting in the basement storage." She held up a small vial filled with a pale blue liquid. Experimental antiviral. Still in trial phase when everything went to hell. Might not cure anything, but it could slow the progression if someone gets bitten. Kalen studied the vial with the same intensity he once reserved for engineering blueprints. How many doses? Enough for maybe 6 people, if we're careful with the measurements. Zephyra's green eyes reflected a mixture of hope and resignation. "There's a group holed up in the old textile mill on the east side. Thaddeus Grimm's people. They've been sending out radio signals, trying to coordinate with other survivors." The name brought a frown to Kalen's weathered face. Thaddeus Grimm had been Millbrook's fire chief for over 2 decades, a man who commanded respect through action rather than words. If anyone could organize a resistance against the undead plague, it would be him. But gathering survivors meant risk, and risk meant exposure to the growing hordes that seemed to multiply with each passing day. A low moan echoed from inside the hardware store, followed by the crash of falling merchandise. One of the creatures had knocked over a display rack, and the noise was already attracting attention from down the street. Kalen could see movement in the distance, shapes emerging from storefronts and alleyways, drawn by the sound like moths to a flame. "We need to move," Zephyra said, checking the tension on her crossbow string. "The noise will bring more of them." As they prepared to leave their hiding spot, Kalen's radio crackled to life with a burst of static. Through the interference, a woman's voice emerged, calm and professional despite the chaos that surrounded them all. "This is Isadora Reeves at the water treatment facility. I repeat, this is Isadora Reeves. We have established a secure perimeter and have clean water and power generation capabilities. Any survivors hearing this message, we are located 3 miles north of the town center. Follow the old railway tracks. We have defensible positions and resources for long-term survival." Kalen and Zephyra exchanged glances. Isadora Reeves had been his project manager on the water treatment upgrade just months before the outbreak. If anyone understood the infrastructure needed to support a group of survivors, it was her. The facility was also elevated, surrounded by open ground that would make approaching threats visible from a distance. Another crash from inside the store, this one louder. The shuffling sounds were getting closer to the broken window. Kalen made a decision that would change the course of everything to come. "We're going to need more than just the 2 of us," he said, tucking the radio into his jacket pocket. "If we're going to make it to the treatment facility, if we're going to build something that lasts, we need to think bigger. We need to bring people together. Zephyra nodded, understanding the implications. Survival was no longer about hiding and scavenging. It was about fighting back, about reclaiming their world from the dead. And that would require the kind of coordination and tactical thinking that only came from groups working together with a common purpose. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing more movement in the streets ahead. Time was running out for half measures and solo survival attempts. The next phase of their ordeal was about to begin. The abandoned textile mill stood like a fortress against the gray sky, its red brick walls scarred by weather and neglect but still fundamentally sound. Smoke rose from the central chimney, a sign of life in a world that had forgotten what warmth meant. Kalen and Zephyra approached from the south, using the rusted machinery of the old loading dock as cover while they observed the building's defenses. Thaddeus Grimm had chosen his stronghold well. The mill was surrounded by a courtyard enclosed by a 12-foot chain-link fence that had been reinforced with sheets of corrugated metal. Watchtowers constructed from shipping containers offered elevated positions for sentries, and the entrance had been narrowed to a single checkpoint that could be easily defended. More importantly, Kalen noted, the modifications showed signs of careful planning rather than desperate improvisation. 3 guards visible, Zephyra murmured, studying the positions through a pair of binoculars she had salvaged from a sporting goods store. 2 on the towers, 1 at the gate. Professional spacing, overlapping fields of fire. These people know what they're doing. A low whistle echoed across the courtyard, 3 short bursts followed by 2 long ones. The gate guard responded with the same pattern, and moments later, a side door opened to reveal a figure waving them forward. Their radio communications had been monitored, their approach anticipated. Thaddeus Grimm met them just inside the entrance, and Kalen was struck by how the man had adapted to their new reality. The fire chief's uniform had been replaced by practical cargo pants and a tactical vest, but his commanding presence remained unchanged. Gray-bearded and broad-shouldered, he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to making life-or-death decisions under pressure. "Engineer Thorne," Thaddeus said, extending a hand that was calloused from decades of emergency response work. "Dr. Blackwood. We've been monitoring your movements for the past 3 days. Impressive survival instincts, both of you." The interior of the mill had been transformed into a functional base of operations. The main floor housed sleeping areas constructed from salvaged materials, while the upper levels had been converted into workshops and storage facilities. Solar panels jury-rigged to the roof provided power for essential systems, and the sound of running water indicated that basic plumbing had been restored. 17 survivors, Thaddeus explained as he led them through the facility. Mix of backgrounds, former military, medical personnel, skilled tradespeople. We've been working on a comprehensive defense strategy, but we're missing key capabilities. They paused beside a large table covered with hand-drawn maps and tactical diagrams. Caspian Vale, a former Army logistics specialist, looked up from his calculations with tired but alert eyes. His weathered face bore the distinctive tan lines of someone who had spent years in desert deployments, and his methodical approach to supply management had kept the group fed and equipped. "The problem isn't holding this position," Caspian explained, pointing to defensive markers on the map. "It's the bigger picture. The hordes are growing, and they're starting to show coordinated behavior. Groups of 30, 40 undead moving together, following what appears to be deliberate patterns." Serafina Moss emerged from a communication station in the corner, removing a headset with a frustrated expression. She had been a cybersecurity analyst before the collapse, and her technical skills had proven invaluable in maintaining contact with other survivor groups. Her auburn hair was streaked with premature gray, a testament to the stress of their situation. "I've been monitoring emergency frequencies across the region," she reported. "The government evacuation zones have gone silent, one by one. Whatever organized response existed in the first few weeks, it's breaking down. We're on our own." The implications hung heavy in the air. Without military support or government coordination, every survivor group was essentially fighting its own war against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. But Kalen saw opportunity in their isolation, the freedom to develop unconventional strategies without bureaucratic interference. "What about Isadora Reeves at the water treatment facility?" Zephyra asked, producing the radio message they had intercepted. "She's offering resources and defensive positions." Thaddeus nodded slowly. "We've been in contact. The facility has advantages: elevated position, reliable power and water, clear sight lines for defense. But it's also isolated. If we commit our people there and get overrun, there's nowhere to retreat." A new voice joined the conversation as Orion Blackwater descended from the upper levels, his boots echoing on the metal stairs. The former park ranger carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone comfortable in dangerous environments, and his knowledge of the surrounding terrain had been crucial in planning supply runs and evacuation routes. "The undead aren't just wandering randomly anymore," Orion said, spreading out a topographical map marked with colored pins. "They're following migration patterns, moving from areas of high initial infection toward pockets of surviving human activity. It's like they can sense us somehow." The assembled group studied the patterns Orion had identified, and a chilling picture emerged. The zombie hordes weren't just growing in size, they were becoming increasingly focused in their movements, concentrating around the remaining strongholds of human resistance. "We need to think beyond just survival," Kalen said, his engineering background driving him toward systematic solutions. "We need to think about rebuilding, about creating something sustainable. And that means connecting the separated groups, pooling our resources and knowledge." Thaddeus leaned back in his chair, considering the proposal. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade, and with darkness would come increased activity from the undead. Time was always their enemy, but so was isolation. "There's risk in unity," he said finally. "But there's certain death in remaining divided." The plan was elegant in its simplicity, which Kalen hoped would make it effective. 3 coordinated teams would move simultaneously toward the water treatment facility, each taking a different route to avoid concentrating the group's survival in a single corridor. The northern team, led by Thaddeus, would follow the railway tracks and serve as the primary communications relay. The eastern team, under Orion's guidance, would navigate through the forested hills that bordered the town. Kalen and Zephyra would lead the southern team through the industrial district, using the maze of warehouses and manufacturing buildings to mask their movement. Each team carried 1/3 of their essential supplies and personnel, ensuring that if one group encountered disaster, the others could continue the mission. It was a calculated risk that acknowledged the harsh mathematics of their new world. Sometimes survival required accepting the possibility of sacrifice. The southern route presented unique challenges. The industrial district had been heavily populated when the outbreak began, and many of the undead had been trapped inside buildings when the initial lockdowns were implemented. Now, weeks later, those buildings had become pressure cookers of infection, ready to release their contents at the slightest disturbance. Vesper Nightingale moved with the fluid grace of someone trained in urban combat, her background as a SWAT team member serving them well in the cramped confines of the warehouse district. She had joined their group only days earlier, but her tactical expertise had already proven invaluable. Her dark eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, reading the subtle signs that indicated imminent danger. "Movement in the Hartwell Industries building," she whispered, gesturing toward a 3-story structure that had once manufactured automotive parts. "Multiple contacts, ground floor. Looks like they're clustered around the employee break room." Zephyra consulted her mental map of the area, drawing on her knowledge of the building's layout from her years treating injured workers at the hospital. "There's a loading dock on the north side. If we can reach it without triggering the group inside, we can bypass the entire complex." The loading dock approach required crossing 50 yards of open ground, an eternity of exposure in their current circumstances. But the alternative meant fighting through an unknown number of undead in the confines of the building, and their ammunition was too precious to waste on unnecessary confrontations. Kalen studied the timing of the patrols they had observed, looking for patterns in the undead movements that could be exploited. His engineering mind automatically calculated angles and probabilities, treating the tactical problem like a complex systems analysis. They're following a cycle, he realized. Every 12 minutes, the group by the employee entrance moves toward the back of the building. That gives us a 4-minute window to cross the open ground and reach the loading dock. The crossing went according to plan for the first 3 minutes. Then Jasper Kane, a young electrician who had volunteered for the mission despite his obvious fear, stumbled over a piece of debris and sent a metal pipe clattering across the pavement. The sound echoed through the industrial complex like a dinner bell, and within seconds, shapes began appearing at windows and doorways throughout the district. "Run," Vesper commanded, her voice cutting through the rising chorus of moans and shuffling feet. "Forget stealth. We sprint for the facility and hope the other teams are ready to support us." What followed was a nightmare chase through the maze of industrial buildings. The undead emerged from every shadow, shambling and crawling toward the sound of living footsteps. Some moved with the slow, methodical pace that had characterized the early stages of infection, but others displayed the enhanced speed and aggression that marked the evolution of the plague. Zephyr's crossbow proved its worth in the running battle, dropping the fastest pursuers with precisely aimed bolts to the head. But for every undead creature they eliminated, 2 more seemed to take its place, drawn by the noise of combat and the scent of living flesh. The water treatment facility appeared ahead of them like a beacon of hope, its elevated position and defensive barriers promising safety from the growing horde behind them. But between their position and the facility's gates lay the most dangerous stretch of their journey, a half-mile of open ground with no cover except for the concrete channels that directed water flow toward the treatment center. "There." Kalen pointed toward a figure standing on the facility's observation deck, waving what appeared to be a signal flag. "Isadora's people have spotted us." The gates of the facility began to open, revealing a coordinated response that spoke to hours of planning and preparation. A suppression team emerged, armed with rifles and positioned to provide covering fire for the approaching survivors. Behind them, medical personnel waited with stretchers and emergency supplies. But the most impressive sight was Isadora Reeves herself, standing calmly beside a control panel that operated the facility's massive water pumps. As the southern team sprinted across the final stretch of open ground, pursued by dozens of undead creatures, she activated the emergency flood protocols. Water erupted from the concrete channels with tremendous force, creating a torrent that swept the pursuing undead off their feet and carried them downstream toward the river. It was a tactical use of infrastructure that demonstrated exactly the kind of innovative thinking they would need to survive in the long term. The gates closed behind them with a resounding clang, sealing out the moans and scratching sounds of the remaining undead. For the first time in weeks, they stood in a space that felt truly secure, surrounded by allies who had proven their competence under pressure. "Welcome to the future," Isadora said, her voice carrying both exhaustion and determination. "Now let's figure out how to make it last." The water treatment facility buzzed with activity as the 3 teams reunited and began integrating their resources. Isadora Reeves had transformed the complex into more than just a defensive position, it had become a prototype for sustainable post-apocalypse living. Solar arrays provided supplemental power to the facility's main generators, hydroponic gardens occupied the former administrative offices, and a sophisticated communication system maintained contact with survivor groups across the region. But it was the people that impressed Kalen most. Where other groups had devolved into strict hierarchies based on fear and scarcity, Isadora had fostered a collaborative environment that valued expertise over authority. Former rivals worked side by side, their pre-outbreak differences rendered meaningless by the shared struggle for survival. Atlas Stonehard emerged from the facility's engineering section, his massive frame moving with surprising grace as he carried a collection of modified radio equipment. The former oil rig supervisor had adapted his industrial experience to their new reality, creating makeshift solutions from salvaged materials. His booming laugh and optimistic demeanor served as a counterweight to the pervasive despair that affected many survivors. "We've got contact with 4 more groups within a 20-mile radius," he announced, setting down the radio array with careful precision. 2 are requesting immediate assistance, low on food and medical supplies. 1 is offering to trade ammunition for technical expertise. And the 4th. He paused, his expression growing serious. The 4th is warning about something they call the gathering. The assembled leaders exchanged concerned glances. They had all noticed changes in undead behavior over recent weeks, increased coordination, more aggressive hunting patterns, and the disturbing tendency for separate groups to converge on survivor settlements. But the gathering suggested something even more ominous. Lyra Starweaver, a former meteorologist who had adapted her analytical skills to tracking undead movement patterns, spread out a collection of observation reports on the central table. Her silver hair was prematurely gray from stress, but her mind remained sharp and focused on the mathematical relationships that governed their enemies' behavior. The reports are consistent across multiple observation points, she explained, pointing to marked locations on her map. Large groups of undead are abandoning their normal territorial patterns and moving toward a central convergence point approximately 15 miles northeast of our position. The estimated numbers are... She hesitated, double-checking her calculations. Potentially in the thousands. The implication was staggering. If thousands of undead were gathering in a single location, they represented a threat that could overwhelm any defensive position through sheer numbers. But more disturbing was the question of what was driving this unprecedented coordination among creatures that had previously shown only basic pack hunting instincts. "We need intelligence," Thaddeus said, his fire chief training asserting itself in the face of an unknown threat. "Real reconnaissance, not just radio reports and speculation. Someone needs to get close enough to see what we're dealing with." Zephyra stepped forward, her medical training making her acutely aware of the risks involved in such a mission. "I'll go. My background gives me the best chance of understanding what's happening to them, whether this is evolution of the infection or something else entirely." "Not alone," Kalen interjected immediately. "We don't send anyone out alone anymore. That's how we lose people." The debate over team composition revealed the delicate balance of personalities that had emerged within their combined group. Trust had to be earned through shared danger, but it also had to be given freely enough to enable necessary risks. After extensive discussion, they settled on a 4-person reconnaissance team: Zephyra for medical expertise, Orion for wilderness navigation, Vesper for tactical skills, and Kalen for analytical assessment. Preparation for the mission revealed both the strengths and limitations of their combined resources. They had sufficient equipment for a multi-day operation, but ammunition remained critically limited. Communications gear was reliable but had limited range in the mountainous terrain they would need to traverse. Most concerning, their medical supplies were barely adequate for normal injuries, let alone the kind of trauma that might result from close contact with a horde of unprecedented size. The night before departure, an unexpected moment of normalcy occurred in the facility's communal area. Serafina had managed to restore power to an old radio, and found a station broadcasting classical music from somewhere far beyond the infected zone. For 30 minutes, the assembled survivors sat in comfortable silence, listening to Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21 and remembering what civilization had sounded like. Caspian used the moment to conduct a quiet inventory of their food stores, his military logistics experience ensuring that calories were allocated efficiently among the growing population. His careful management had extended their supplies far beyond what simple rationing could have achieved, but even his expertise couldn't create resources from nothing. "We've got maybe 6 weeks of food if no one else joins us," he reported to the leadership group after the music ended. "For weeks if we keep taking in new people at the current rate. The hydroponic gardens are helping, but they're not producing enough to sustain a group this size." The mathematics of survival were relentless. Every new person they rescued represented both an additional resource and an additional mouth to feed. Every day that passed without establishing contact with agricultural communities or finding new food sources brought them closer to impossible choices between compassion and survival. As the reconnaissance team prepared for departure, Isadora pulled Kalen aside for a private conversation. Her engineering background made her uniquely qualified to understand the technical challenges they faced in building a sustainable community, but her administrative experience gave her insight into the human dynamics that could make or break their efforts. "There's something you need to know about what we're building here," she said, her voice carrying the weight of difficult decisions. "This isn't just about surviving the next week or month. We're trying to preserve something worth surviving for. And that means making choices that prioritize the long-term future over short-term safety." Kaelin nodded, understanding the implications. The reconnaissance mission was dangerous, but ignoring the gathering horde would be suicidal. Sometimes survival required accepting risks that felt like certain death, gambling everything on the slim chance of discovering a path forward. The pre-dawn departure was marked by brief farewells and equipment checks, professional efficiency masking personal concerns. As the reconnaissance team disappeared into the darkness beyond the facility's gates, those left behind began their own preparations for whatever intelligence the mission might reveal. The real test of their unity was about to begin. The reconnaissance team moved through the pre-dawn darkness with practiced efficiency, following game trails that Orion had scouted during his years as a park ranger. The forest offered concealment from undead detection, but it also limited their ability to observe threats at a distance. Every step forward was a calculated risk, balanced against the critical need for intelligence about the gathering horde. By the third day of their approach, the signs of massive undead movement became impossible to ignore. Trees showed fresh damage from countless bodies passing through the undergrowth. The forest floor was littered with clothing fragments and personal effects dropped by creatures that no longer understood their significance. Most disturbing were the cleared paths, narrow corridors through dense vegetation that suggested deliberate route finding rather than random wandering. Vesper's tactical expertise proved invaluable as they navigated the increasingly dangerous terrain. Her ability to read sign and anticipate ambush sites kept them ahead of several roving groups of undead that seemed to be moving toward the same destination. But it was her psychological insight that provided the most unsettling observations. "They're not hunting anymore," she said during a brief rest stop, watching a group of undead shamble past their hiding position. "Look at their movement patterns. They're not searching for food or reacting to stimuli. They're migrating, like animals following seasonal patterns that they don't consciously understand." Zephyra studied the passing creatures through binoculars, her medical training allowing her to assess their physical condition with clinical precision. What she observed challenged everything they thought they knew about the infection's progression. These undead showed signs of advanced decay that should have rendered them immobile, yet they moved with purpose and coordination that seemed to improve with time. "The decomposition isn't following normal patterns," she murmured, making notes in a waterproof journal. "Muscle tissue that should have liquefied weeks ago is still functional. Neural pathways that should have been destroyed by cellular death are somehow maintaining basic coordination. It's like the infection is preserving only the systems necessary for locomotion and basic group behavior." The fourth day brought them to an overlook that provided their first clear view of the gathering site. What they saw defied every assumption they had made about undead behavior and organization. The creatures had assembled in a natural amphitheater formed by surrounding hills, creating a mass of bodies that stretched for nearly a quarter-mile. But this wasn't a random congregation, it was an organized formation. Kaelin's engineering mind struggled to process the implications of what lay before them. The undead had arranged themselves in concentric circles around a central area that remained mysteriously empty. The formation showed signs of planning and spatial awareness that suggested intelligence far beyond what individual creatures had demonstrated. Most disturbing was the patience, thousands of undead standing motionless for hours, waiting for something that only they understood. "Count the circles," Orion whispered, his ranger training enabling him to estimate the crowd size with reasonable accuracy. 7 distinct rings, roughly 300 individuals per ring. That's over 2,000 undead in one location. But numbers weren't the most frightening aspect of what they observed. As the day progressed, new groups continued to arrive from all directions, integrating seamlessly into the existing formation. Each new arrival seemed to know exactly where to position itself, as if responding to signals that the human observers couldn't detect. Zephyra's medical expertise led her to a horrifying conclusion about the empty center of the formation. "They're waiting for something specific," she said, studying the behavior patterns through her binoculars. "The positioning, the timing of arrivals, the way they orient themselves toward the central area, it's like they're preparing for some kind of event." The answer came at sunset, when the undead suddenly became active with synchronized precision. The outer rings began to shift and reorganize, creating clear pathways toward the center while maintaining their overall formation. The movement was coordinated across thousands of individuals, executed with a timing that suggested either collective intelligence or external control. What emerged from the crowd was something that challenged the fundamental nature of what they thought they were fighting. A figure moved through the pathways created by the undead masses, walking upright with steady purpose rather than the shambling gait that characterized normal infected individuals. As it reached the center of the formation, the assembled horde fell completely silent. The figure stood approximately 6 feet tall, but its proportions seemed somehow wrong: limbs that were too long for its torso, a head that tilted at unnatural angles, movements that flowed with predatory grace. When it raised its arms, every undead creature in the formation responded by turning to face outward, away from the center, as if preparing to receive orders. "That's not possible," Vesper breathed, her tactical training struggling to categorize what they were witnessing. "Undead don't organize. They don't follow leaders. They respond to stimuli, not commands." But the evidence before them contradicted everything they thought they knew about their enemy. The infection had evolved beyond their understanding, creating not just individual threats but a collective entity capable of strategic thinking and coordinated action. The implications for every survivor community in the region were catastrophic. Kalen felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. The intelligence they had gathered was more critical than any of them had anticipated, but it was also more dangerous. Knowledge of the undead's evolution would be essential for survival, but it would also spread panic and despair among groups that were barely holding together under the stress of daily survival. As darkness fell and the assembled horde began to disperse in organized groups heading toward different points of the compass, the reconnaissance team faced a terrible realization. They weren't just observing the gathering, they were witnessing the deployment of an army. And that army was heading directly toward every known survivor stronghold in the region. The race back to the water treatment facility became a desperate sprint against time, carrying intelligence that could save or doom every person they had sworn to protect. The emergency assembly at the water treatment facility convened in the pre-dawn hours, illuminated by the harsh glare of emergency lighting that cast stark shadows across the faces of the assembled leaders. The intelligence brought back by the reconnaissance team had shattered every assumption about their enemy and the nature of the threat they faced. Maps covered every available surface, marked with projected movement patterns and defensive calculations that grew more desperate with each revision. Isadora stood before the gathered survivors, her usual calm composure strained by the magnitude of the decisions they faced. The facility that had seemed like an impregnable fortress now felt like a trap, surrounded by open ground that would provide no cover against a coordinated assault by thousands of undead. But abandoning their position meant abandoning the infrastructure that kept them alive. "We have approximately 18 hours before the first wave reaches our perimeter," she announced, her voice carrying across the silent room. "Based on the reconnaissance data, we're looking at a minimum of 500 undead in the initial assault, with additional waves following at roughly 6-hour intervals." Atlas stepped forward from the engineering section, his massive frame somehow diminished by the scope of the challenge they faced. His usual optimism had been replaced by grim determination as he outlined the modifications they could make to their defenses in the limited time available. "We can create choke points using the water diversion channels," he explained, pointing to the facility's layout diagram. "Flood certain approaches, force them into kill zones where our limited ammunition can be most effective. But the primary defensive barrier won't hold against numbers like these. We need layered fallback positions." Caspian's logistics expertise painted an even bleaker picture. Their ammunition supplies, carefully rationed over weeks of cautious survival, would be exhausted within hours of sustained combat. Food stores that had been stretched to feed their growing community would need to sustain them through a siege of unknown duration. Medical supplies were barely adequate for routine injuries, let alone the casualties that mass combat would inevitably produce. "We're looking at a tactical withdrawal to secondary positions," he said, his military training evident in the clinical precision of his assessment. "The main facility becomes a delaying action while non-combatants evacuate to prepared fallback sites. But that means abandoning most of our equipment and supplies." Serafina's communication intercepts had revealed the broader scope of the crisis. Survivor groups across the region were reporting similar organized attacks, coordinated assaults that suggested the Undead leadership was implementing a comprehensive strategy to eliminate human resistance. Some communities had already gone silent, their emergency broadcasts ending in static and screams. "The pattern is consistent," she reported, her technical background enabling her to analyze the tactical data with uncomfortable clarity. "They're not just attacking randomly. They're prioritizing locations with the greatest strategic value: power generation facilities, water treatment plants, medical centers, communication hubs. They're systematically destroying our infrastructure." The implications were staggering. The Undead weren't just seeking to feed on the living, they were actively working to prevent human recovery and rebuilding. It suggested a level of strategic thinking that transformed the conflict from a survival challenge into an existential war for the future of human civilization. Lyra's meteorological expertise provided one slim hope for defensive advantage. Weather patterns indicated a major storm system approaching the region, with heavy rain and high winds that would reduce visibility and complicate coordinated movement for both attackers and defenders. But the same conditions that might disrupt Undead organization would also hamper human defensive efforts. The debate over evacuation versus defense revealed the fundamental tensions that existed within their united community. Those with military backgrounds advocated for strategic withdrawal to preserve personnel for future operations. Civilian specialists argued for defending the facility's irreplaceable infrastructure. Medical personnel prioritized saving the most vulnerable members of their group, regardless of strategic considerations. Zephyra found herself caught between her medical oath to preserve life and her growing understanding of the tactical realities they faced. The antiviral samples she had discovered weeks earlier remained their only potential weapon against the infection itself, but using them would require close contact with infected individuals during active combat. The risk was enormous, but the potential payoff could change the entire nature of their conflict. "I need volunteers for a direct intervention protocol," she announced, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "If the antiviral compound can slow or reverse the infection process, we might be able to disrupt their coordination at the source. But it means getting close enough to inject the leader figure that was observed at the gathering." The silence that followed her proposal was deafening. What she was suggesting bordered on suicide, penetrating the heart of an undead army to attempt an untested medical intervention on a creature that defied classification. But it also represented their only chance of transforming certain defeat into possible victory. Kalen stepped forward without hesitation, his engineering background making him uniquely qualified to assess the technical challenges of such a mission. "I'm in. We'll need precise timing, multiple contingencies, and extraction plans that account for total defensive failure. But if there's a chance to end this at the source, we have to take it." One by one, others volunteered for what they all understood might be a final mission. Vesper's tactical expertise, Orion's wilderness navigation skills, Atlas's technical improvisation abilities, each person brought capabilities that could mean the difference between heroic sacrifice and meaningful victory. As the storm clouds gathered overhead and the distant sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the landscape, the defenders of the water treatment facility prepared to make their last stand against an enemy that threatened not just their lives, but the very possibility of human future. The battle for survival was about to become a battle for the soul of their species. The storm arrived with the first wave of undead, turning the water treatment facility's defensive perimeter into a nightmare landscape of mud, rain, and shambling figures that emerged from the darkness like manifestations of humanity's worst fears. Lightning illuminated scenes of coordinated assault that defied every assumption about undead capabilities, creatures working together to bridge water barriers, others boosting their companions over defensive obstacles, all moving with purpose that spoke to controlling intelligence rather than mindless hunger. Kalen led the intervention team through a maintenance tunnel that Atlas had modified to provide concealed access to the facility's outer perimeter. The antiviral compound, carefully distributed among syringes designed for emergency deployment, represented their only hope of disrupting the undead coordination at its source. But reaching the leader figure would require penetrating to the center of the attacking force while the main defensive battle raged around them. The compound's generators hummed with strained efficiency as Isadora coordinated the layered defense from the central control room. Her engineering expertise enabled her to manipulate the facility's systems as tactical weapons, flooding approach routes, activating high-pressure water jets to knock attackers off balance, even using the facility's chemical treatment systems to create temporary barriers of caustic foam. But each innovation bought them minutes rather than hours, and the undead seemed to adapt to each new obstacle with disturbing speed. Zephyra moved through the chaos with medical precision, her trauma surgery experience allowing her to function effectively despite the horror surrounding them. The antiviral injection she carried had been modified based on her analysis of the infection's progression, a desperate gamble based on theoretical understanding rather than controlled testing. If her hypothesis was wrong, they would all die for nothing. If she was right, they might save not just their own community but every surviving human settlement in the region. The intervention team reached the outer perimeter just as the defensive line began to buckle under sustained assault. Thaddeus's fire department training served him well in coordinating the tactical withdrawal, but even his experience couldn't compensate for the sheer numbers they faced. The undead weren't just attacking, they were learning, adapting their approach based on the defenders' responses, showing tactical flexibility that transformed them from predictable threats into strategic opponents. Through the rain and confusion, Kalen spotted their target, the leader figure moving among the attacking forces with fluid grace, its presence somehow coordinating the assault in ways that defied explanation. Up close, the creature was even more disturbing than their distant observations had suggested. Its movements were too smooth, its awareness too complete, as if the infection had preserved not just motor function but enhanced cognitive abilities beyond normal human limitations. Vesper's tactical expertise guided them through the battlefield, using the chaos of combat to mask their approach toward the creature that commanded the undead army. Her SWAT training enabled her to read the flow of battle, identifying moments of opportunity when defensive attention was focused elsewhere. But getting close enough for Zephyra to deploy the antiviral required exposing themselves to immediate danger from dozens of lesser undead that surrounded their target. The injection attempt succeeded beyond their most optimistic projections, and failed in ways they hadn't anticipated. The antiviral compound affected the leader creature immediately, causing it to stagger and lose coordination as the infection's neural pathways began to destabilize. The surrounding undead responded to their leader's distress with confusion and disorganization that rippled outward through the attacking force like a wave of neurological disruption. But the creature's death throes triggered something none of them had expected. As its enhanced neural network collapsed, it released what could only be described as a psychic scream, a burst of raw emotion and memory that affected every person within a half-mile radius. For 30 seconds that felt like hours, the intervention team experienced flashes of retained human consciousness trapped within the infection, fragments of identity and memory that had somehow survived the transformation process. The revelation was more horrifying than the physical threat they had been fighting. The undead weren't just reanimated corpses, they were people, still partially aware but unable to control their actions, trapped within bodies that had become weapons against everything they had once loved. The leader creature hadn't been controlling the horde through some supernatural power, it had been the focal point for their collective suffering, a conduit for the anguish of thousands of souls unable to die or truly live. In the aftermath of the leader's destruction, the attacking undead didn't simply stop moving, they began to remember. Some collapsed as the infection lost its grip on their motor functions. Others wandered aimlessly, as if waking from a nightmare they couldn't quite recall. A few even spoke, fragmented words and phrases that revealed glimpses of the people they had been before the outbreak consumed their world. The victory was complete but devastating. The immediate threat to the facility had ended, but the cost was measured in more than casualties and damaged infrastructure. Every survivor now carried the knowledge that their enemies had once been neighbors, friends, family members who had suffered unimaginable torment while their bodies committed atrocities against their will. As dawn broke over the water treatment facility, revealing the extent of the night's destruction, the assembled survivors faced a future that was both hopeful and haunting. They had proven that the infection could be fought and defeated, but they had also learned that victory came with moral complexities that would shadow every future decision. Isadora stood among the debris of their defensive positions, watching Orion and others tend to the undead who had retained enough consciousness to communicate. Some begged for death to end their suffering. Others pleaded for forgiveness for actions they couldn't control. All of them served as reminders that the line between victim and threat was far thinner than anyone had realized. The radio crackled with reports from other survivor communities, confirming that the coordinated attacks had ended with their leader's destruction. But the messages also carried new questions about treatment protocols for the partially recovered, ethical guidelines for dealing with those who remained dangerous despite regaining some awareness, and the psychological support needed for people learning that they had killed their own transformed loved ones in self-defense. Serafina's communication systems buzzed with traffic from government remnants attempting to re-establish contact with surviving communities. The bureaucratic language couldn't disguise the desperation in their transmissions. Entire evacuation zones had been lost, military units had gone silent, and the organized response that had sustained hope for months had effectively collapsed. In the facility's medical bay, Zephyra worked to synthesize more antiviral compound while grappling with the ethical implications of her discovery. The treatment could potentially restore partial consciousness to millions of infected individuals, but many of them would choose death over continued existence in compromised bodies. The power to offer that choice was a burden she had never wanted to carry. As the immediate crisis passed and the work of rebuilding began, the survivors of the water treatment facility found themselves at the center of a transformation that would reshape the post-apocalyptic world. They had weapons against the infection now, but they also had responsibilities that extended far beyond their own survival. The future they were building would be haunted by the memory of those they had been forced to destroy, shadowed by the knowledge that victory and tragedy were often indistinguishable. But it would also be illuminated by the possibility of redemption, by the chance to save rather than simply survive, and by the hope that humanity could rebuild something better from the ashes of what had been lost. The undead apocalypse was ending, but the work of healing was just beginning.